Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep, into the mind of a philosopher who is notorious for turning traditional morality upside down, making people uncomfortable, and challenging everything you think you know about good and evil. We're talking about Friedrich Nietzsche and his groundbreaking work, Beyond Good and Evil.
Nietzsche's ideas are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. He really forces us to confront those uncomfortable questions about morality, truth, and the nature of power.
So what makes Nietzsche so controversial? He basically threw a philosophical grenade into the world of traditional thought.
Well, one of the most shocking things Nietzsche did was question the very foundation of good and evil. He argued that these concepts aren't absolute truths, but rather constructs created by those in power. Imagine morality as a tool, something that's been shaped and wielded by the dominant forces in society. That's how Nietzsche saw it.
That's a really thought-provoking way to look at it. It's like those in power get to define what's good and what's evil to maintain their control.
Precisely. And this ties directly into his concept of the will to power, which Nietzsche saw as the fundamental driving force behind all human behavior.
Okay, I've heard of the will to power, but to be honest, I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
It's not just about brute force or physical domination. It's more nuanced than that. Think of it as the inherent drive we all have to exert influence to shape the world around us, to leave our mark. Even our quest for knowledge, our desire to understand things, could be seen as an expression of this will to power.
So even seemingly positive actions like pursuing knowledge can be driven by this desire for power.
According to Nietzsche, yes. It's about the underlying motivation. Let me give you an example. Let's say you dedicate your life to uncovering a scientific breakthrough. That seems like a noble pursuit, right? But what if, deep down, you're driven by the desire to be recognized, to have your name etched in history books? That's where the will to power comes in.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. It's like he's peeling back the layers of human motivation and revealing what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And he didn't shy away from using bold language to drive his point home. For example, his famous statement, "God is dead." That wasn't meant to be taken literally. It was a metaphor for the decline of traditional religious values and the idea that humans were now responsible for creating their own meaning.
Okay, so he wasn't advocating for atheism, but rather highlighting a shift in how we view authority and meaning.
Precisely. And speaking of challenging authority, Nietzsche didn't spare his fellow philosophers from his critique. He argued that even those dedicated to the pursuit of truth are often influenced by unconscious biases and hidden motives.
So he's saying that even philosophers who are supposed to be these objective thinkers are actually driven by their own personal agendas.
In a way, yes. He believed that our will to truth can actually mask other desires, like the desire for certainty, comfort, or even power itself. Think about it. If you believe you hold the truth, it gives you a certain power over others.
I see what you mean. It's like claiming to have the truth can be a way of asserting dominance over others.
Exactly. And Nietzsche believed that these hidden motives can distort our perception of reality, leading us astray from genuine understanding. He even went as far as to say that the concept of truth itself is problematic, arguing that there are multiple perspectives and interpretations. This concept is known as Perspectivism.
Perspectivism. I like that.
Yeah.
So instead of searching for one absolute truth, we should be open to considering different points of view.
That's a core tenet of perspectivism. It's about recognizing the limitations of our own viewpoint and acknowledging the validity of other perspectives.
Okay, so Nietzsche was all about shaking things up, challenging assumptions, and making us question everything. And he wasn't afraid to target the very people who claimed to have all the answers.
Right. He was especially critical of the herd mentality, where people blindly follow the crowd and avoid questioning the status quo. In contrast, he admired the free spirit, the individual who dared to question everything and forge their own path.
That sounds a lot like his idea of the Übermensch, right? The individual who transcends conventional morality and creates their own values.
Exactly. The Übermensch is often mistranslated as Superman, but it's not about physical strength or superpowers. It's about a higher state of being a person who embraces their individuality and lives life on their own terms.
That's fascinating. It's like he's saying we all have the potential to become Übermensch by tapping into our will to power and creating our own meaning in a world without predetermined answers.
That's a great way to put it. Nietzsche believed that the death of God or the decline of traditional belief systems created both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because we can no longer rely on external authorities to tell us what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
But it's also an opportunity because we're now free to create our own values and define our own purpose.
It's like he's throwing open the doors and saying, the world is your canvas. Now go create something amazing.
Precisely. And speaking of creating something amazing, Nietzsche had a lot to say about the power of the human spirit to overcome challenges and even find meaning in suffering. He believed that the bad conscience, that feeling of guilt and self-doubt that we all experience, actually be a sign of spiritual depth and growth.
Wait, so the things that make us feel bad about ourselves can actually be good for us?
According to Nietzsche, yes. He argued that the bad conscience arises when we internalize the values and norms of the herd. It's a sign that we're capable of self-reflection and critical thinking, even if it's initially painful. He saw it as a necessary step on the path to becoming a free spirit, someone who can transcend the limitations of conventional morality.
Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. It's like he's saying that our ability to feel guilt and shame actually indicates a higher level of consciousness. It means we're not just blindly following the herd.
Exactly. We're capable of questioning those inherited values and developing our own moral compass. And speaking of morality, Nietzsche had some radical ideas about how morality itself has evolved over time, even going so far as to distinguish between what he called master morality and slave morality.
Okay, this sounds intriguing. I've never heard of these concepts before. Can you explain them?
Master morality, according to Nietzsche, originates from the strong and powerful. They value qualities like strength, pride, and nobility, and they create their own values without seeking approval from others. They are the lawgivers, not the law followers.
So they're kind of like the rule makers, the ones who set the standards for everyone else.
Exactly. On the other hand, slave morality arises from the weak and resentful. They value things like humility, compassion, and selflessness. They create values that react against the power of the masters.
So it's almost like a reaction to those in power, a way of saying, we may not be strong, but at least we're good.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche argued that qualities often considered virtuous, like pity and altruism, can actually be expressions of weakness and resentment. He believed that slave morality essentially seeks to pull down those who are stronger rather than striving for excellence themselves.
Wow, that's a pretty controversial take.
Yeah.
So he's not saying that compassion or humility are inherently bad, but that they can be used to mask other motivations like resentment and a desire to control others.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's all about understanding the underlying psychology and questioning those motivations. Nietzsche was a master at doing that. He wanted us to peel back the layers and see things for what they really are, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
He definitely succeeded in making people uncomfortable, especially when it came to his views on religion. He was particularly critical of Christianity, wasn't he?
He was. He saw Christianity as a prime example of slave morality, promoting a worldview that glorifies weakness and suffering. He argued that the concept of sin, for instance, is a tool for controlling and subjugating individuals.
So instead of empowering people to reach their full potential, he felt Christianity was keeping them trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-denial. And I remember you mentioning that his famous phrase, God is dead, wasn't meant to be taken literally.
Right. It's a metaphor for the decline of traditional belief systems and the idea that humans are now responsible for creating their own meaning. He saw this as both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because we can no longer rely on predetermined moral codes, but an opportunity to move beyond the limitations of those old belief systems and embrace a more individualistic approach to morality.
So it's about taking ownership of our beliefs and values rather than blindly accepting what we've been told.
Exactly. It's about becoming conscious creators of our own lives and our own meaning. Now, before we move on, we have to address the elephant in the room. Nietzsche's views on women. Some of his writing can seem, well, let's just say, problematic to modern readers.
I was going to ask about that. It's one thing to challenge societal norms, but we certainly don't want to condone sexism or prejudice.
Of course not. And it's important to approach Nietzsche's writing on women with both sensitivity and critical thinking. We can't simply dismiss him as a misogynist, but we also can't ignore the potentially harmful implications of some of his statements. It's a complex issue that requires careful consideration.
So how should we approach his writings about women then?
I think the key is to recognize the historical context in which he was writing, and to avoid interpreting his words solely through a modern lens. He was a product of his time, and his views on gender roles were certainly influenced by the prevailing social norms of 19th century Europe. However, that doesn't excuse any genuinely sexist or misogynistic statements, and we should be critical of those when we encounter them.
That makes sense. It's like trying to understand a historical figure without condoning any of their harmful or outdated views.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Nietzsche's work on women is complex and often contradictory. While he made some statements that might be considered sexist, he also expressed admiration for women's intuition, emotional depth, and unique strengths. He saw women as possessing a distinct nature in psychology, which he sometimes praised and other times criticized.
So he didn't have a simple or one-dimensional view of women, but rather a more complex and nuanced perspective that reflected the contradictions of his time.
That's a good way to put it. And while some of his aphorisms on women might raise eyebrows today, others offer intriguing and occasionally humorous insights into the dynamics between the sexes.
Well, it sounds like we need to dive deeper into this topic to get a clear understanding of Nietzsche's views on women and how they fit into his overall philosophy. But perhaps we should save that for the next part of our deep dive.
I agree. There's a lot more to unpack when it comes to Nietzsche's complex and challenging ideas about women. It's fascinating how Nietzsche manages to connect seemingly disparate ideas like morality, power, and even our understanding of the self. He ties them all together through this lens of the will to power, arguing that it shapes everything from our personal beliefs to the structures of society.
Yeah, that's what makes his work so thought-provoking. He doesn't shy away from tackling those big existential questions that most people try to avoid. But let's go back to this will to power for a moment. You mentioned it's often misunderstood. Some people see it as a justification for violence and domination. How should we interpret this concept?
Well, it's true that some have twisted Nietzsche's words to fit their own agendas, but the will to power isn't about brute force or subjugating others. It's a much more nuanced concept operating on multiple levels.
So it's not about becoming a dictator or conquering the world?
Not necessarily. While it can encompass those things, it's primarily about the drive for self-realization and personal growth. Think of it as the force that pushes us to overcome obstacles, to express ourselves authentically, and to become the best versions of ourselves.
So it's about conquering our own limitations and striving for excellence.
Exactly. It's about that inner drive to push beyond our comfort zones, to strive for something greater, to achieve mastery in our chosen pursuits. And that striving, that overcoming, is what gives life meaning, according to Nietzsche. He rejected the idea that there's some inherent purpose or meaning to existence. Instead, we create our own meaning through our actions and choices.
That's a powerful concept. It's both daunting and liberating to think that we're responsible for creating our own meaning, but it also puts us in the driver's seat.
Precisely. It's about embracing the freedom and responsibility that comes with recognizing that we are the authors of our own lives. And Nietzsche believed that facing this challenge head-on was the only way to live a truly authentic and fulfilling life.
Okay, so we've talked about the will to power and how it drives us to create meaning. But how does this connect to his ideas about morality? We touched upon master morality and slave morality, but I'd love to delve deeper into those concepts.
Well, Nietzsche's critique of traditional morality is one of his most controversial contributions. He argued that many moral systems, particularly those rooted in religion, actually stifle human potential and prevent us from achieving true greatness.
So instead of helping us become better people, these moral systems actually hold us back.
That's what Nietzsche believed. He argued that these systems often promote values like obedience, humility, and self-denial, which he saw as tools for controlling the masses and keeping them subservient to those in power.
So it's not about genuinely becoming more virtuous, but about maintaining existing power structures?
Exactly. And that's where the distinction between master morality and slave morality comes in.
Can you remind us about those two types of morality again?
Master morality originates from the strong and powerful. They create their own values based on what they deem noble and life-affirming. They don't seek approval from others. They are the lawgivers, not the law followers. Think of ancient Greek heroes or Renaissance artists, individuals who boldly defied convention and carved their own paths.
They sound like true individualists, not afraid to stand out from the crowd.
Exactly. Now, slave morality, on the other hand, arises from resentment and a desire to pull down those who are stronger. It emphasizes values like humility, compassion, and selflessness, which Nietzsche saw as reactions against the power of the masters.
So instead of striving for excellence themselves, those who subscribe to slave morality try to level the playing field by denigrating those who are successful.
That's one way to interpret it. And Nietzsche argued that slave morality has permeated much of Western culture, leading to a devaluation of strength, ambition, and individuality.
That's a pretty bold claim. So he's not saying that compassion or humility are bad in themselves, but that they could be used to mask other less noble motivations.
Precisely. And it's important to note that Nietzsche wasn't advocating for cruelty or ruthlessness. He simply wanted to expose the hypocrisy and resentment that often lie beneath the surface of these seemingly virtuous qualities.
Okay, I see what you mean. He's challenging us to be more honest with ourselves about our motivations and to make sure our actions are aligned with our values. And this ties back to his call for self-creation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Nietzsche believed that true morality should be life-affirming, focused on growth and self-realization rather than guilt and self-denial. And he challenged us to become conscious creators of our own moral code, one that aligns with our unique strengths and aspirations.
That's a powerful idea. It suggests that morality isn't about blindly following a set of rules, but about developing an internal compass that guides us toward a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Precisely. It's about becoming who we truly are, not who society tells us we should be. And this ties directly into Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, which, as we mentioned earlier, is often misunderstood.
Yes, it's been misappropriated by some pretty terrible groups throughout history. But what did Nietzsche really mean by the Übermensch?
It's important to remember that the Übermensch is not about physical dominance or racial superiority. It's about a new type of human being who transcends the limitations of traditional morality and creates their own values based on a deep understanding of themselves and the world.
So it's not about being a Superman in the literal sense.
No. It's about reaching our full potential as individuals, embracing our creativity, and living life on our own terms. The Übermensch isn't bound by conventional morality, but rather by a higher set of values that they create for themselves.
So it's about self-mastery, self-creation, and living a life of meaning and purpose.
Exactly. It's about embracing the challenge of becoming who we're meant to be, even if it means defying societal norms and forging our own path.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The will to power, master morality versus slave morality, and the concept of the Übermensch. It's a lot to take in. Can you help us connect these ideas to the bigger picture? What's the overall message Nietzsche is trying to convey?
Nietzsche was, above all, a champion of individuality, self-reliance, and the power of the human spirit to overcome obstacles and create something new and beautiful in the world. He wanted us to shake off the shackles of outdated moral systems, to embrace our strengths, to confront our weaknesses, and to live lives that are authentic, meaningful, and truly our own.
It sounds like he's calling for a radical shift in consciousness, a rejection of conformity, and a celebration of what makes each of us unique.
That's a great way to put it. He saw himself as a destroyer of idols, someone who was willing to tear down the old structures of thought and morality to make way for something new and more life-affirming.
That takes courage. Not everyone is willing to challenge those deeply ingrained beliefs that society holds dear.
That's true. But Nietzsche believed that true progress comes not from conformity, but from embracing diversity, from allowing individuals to express themselves fully and authentically, even if that means challenging the status quo. He saw the beauty and difference in the unique perspectives and experiences that each individual brings to the world.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to stand out. Don't be afraid to be different. Embrace your uniqueness and let your light shine.
That's the spirit of Nietzsche in a nutshell. And his work continues to resonate with us today because he addressed fundamental questions about the human condition that are just as relevant now as they were then.
Questions about morality, meaning, and the nature of power? Big stuff.
Big stuff indeed. And he tackled these questions with a boldness and originality that continues to inspire and challenge us to this day.
You know, what's really striking about Nietzsche's work is how he managed to weave together so many different ideas, philosophy, psychology, religion, art, into this incredibly rich and thought-provoking tapestry. It's not just dry academic philosophy. There's a real depth and complexity to his writing.
Absolutely. He was a true polymath, someone who drew insights from a wide range of disciplines, and he was a master of language. His writing is full of vivid imagery aphorisms, those short, pithy sayings, and clever wordplay. He wanted to engage not just the intellect, but also the emotions and the imagination.
And he certainly succeeded in doing that. His writing is so powerful and evocative, it stays with you long after you finish reading it.
That's the mark of a truly great thinker, someone whose ideas continue to resonate and spark debate generations later.
Now, we've talked a lot about the positive aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, the emphasis on individuality, self-creation, and striving for excellence. But he also delved into the darker aspects of human nature, didn't he? He wasn't afraid to explore those uncomfortable truths that many of us would rather ignore.
That's right. He believed that true self-knowledge requires confronting those darker impulses within ourselves, those drives that often conflict with our conscious values and aspirations.
So instead of trying to repress or deny those darker aspects of ourselves, he's saying we need to acknowledge them and understand how they shape our thoughts, emotions, and actions.
Exactly. He believed that by understanding these darker impulses, we can gain greater control over them and prevent them from controlling us. It's about integrating those shadow sides of ourselves, rather than pretending they don't exist.
That's an important point. It's about accepting our whole selves, both the light and the shadow.
Precisely. And Nietzsche believed that true strength comes not from denying our weaknesses, but from confronting them head on and finding ways to transform them into sources of power and creativity.
That's a really interesting perspective. It suggests that our flaws and imperfections can actually be valuable assets if we're willing to embrace them and learn from them.
And it's a message that's particularly relevant in a culture that often encourages us to strive for unattainable ideals of perfection. Nietzsche reminds us that it's okay to be imperfect, to have flaws, to make mistakes. It's through those imperfections that we learn and grow.
It's like he's saying, embrace your imperfections.
Yeah.
They're what make you unique. They're what give you character.
That's the spirit of Nietzsche. He was a champion of individuality, of embracing those qualities that make us different, even if those qualities don't fit neatly into society's preconceived notions of what's good or desirable. And he wasn't afraid to challenge those societal norms, to push back against those forces that try to homogenize us and make us all conform to a single standard.
He was all about breaking free from those constraints and encouraging us to embrace our true selves.
Exactly. He believed that true progress comes not from conformity, but from embracing diversity, from allowing individuals to express themselves fully and authentically, even if that means challenging the status quo. He saw the beauty and difference in the unique perspectives and experiences that each individual brings to the world.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to stand out. Don't be afraid to be different. Embrace your uniqueness and let your light shine.
That captures Nietzsche's essence beautifully. He was a philosopher who celebrated the power of the individual, the beauty of difference, and the transformative potential of confronting life's challenges with courage and a willingness to question everything.
Now, we've already touched upon his critiques of traditional morality and religion, but can we dive a bit deeper into his analysis of how power operates in society?
Absolutely. Nietzsche was a keen observer of human behavior, and he recognized that power dynamics are at play in virtually every aspect of our lives, from our personal relationships to our political systems. He wasn't afraid to expose those power structures and the ways in which they can be used to control and manipulate individuals.
So he's encouraging us to be critical thinkers, to look beyond the surface and question the motives that drive the actions of both individuals and institutions.
Exactly. He wants us to be aware of the subtle ways in which power operates, to recognize the tactics that are used to gain and maintain control, and to resist those forces that would seek to limit our freedom and autonomy.
He's empowering us to see through those manipulations and to assert our own agency.
Precisely. It's about becoming conscious of those power dynamics so we can navigate them more effectively and resist being controlled by them. Nietzsche was a philosopher who believed in empowering individuals, in helping them see the world more clearly, and to act with greater agency and purpose.
That's a valuable lesson, especially in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information and influences from all sides.
It is. And Nietzsche's work provides us with a powerful toolkit for navigating that complexity. He gives us a language for understanding power, for analyzing its manifestations, and for resisting its more insidious forms.
So it's not just about passively observing the world, but about actively engaging with it, about using our knowledge and understanding to create positive change.
That's a great way to put it. Nietzsche was a philosopher who believed in the transformative power of ideas, in the ability of human beings to shape their own destinies, and to create a world that is more equitable and more fulfilling for all.
And that's a message that resonates deeply with me.
It does with me as well, and it's a message that I think is more important now than ever before.
Now, before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to one more key aspect of Nietzsche's work: his fascination with the power of language.
Ah, yes. He was a master wordsmith himself, and he recognized that language is not just a tool for communication, but also a powerful force that shapes our thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions. He saw language as a double-edged sword. It can illuminate truth, but it can also be used to deceive and manipulate.
So the words we use, the stories we tell ourselves, they actually have the power to create our reality.
In a way, yes. Nietzsche believed that language is not a neutral medium. It carries within it all sorts of assumptions, biases, and cultural baggage that can influence the way we understand ourselves and the world around us.
So he's encouraging us to be more mindful of the language we use, both the language we speak and the language we think in.
Absolutely. He wants us to be aware of the power of words, to understand how they can be used to manipulate and control, and to choose our words carefully so that they reflect our own values and intentions.
It's like he's saying, pay attention to the stories you're telling yourself. Are they empowering you or limiting you? Are they based on truth or on illusions?
That's a brilliant way to frame it. Nietzsche believed that true freedom comes not just from breaking free of external constraints, but also from liberating ourselves from the mental prisons we create through our own language and thinking. It's about taking ownership of our thoughts and recognizing how they shape our reality.
That's such a powerful idea. It suggests that we have the capacity to reshape our own realities by becoming more conscious of the language we use and the stories we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And that kind of self-awareness is a key step on the path to personal growth and self-mastery, which aligns perfectly with Nietzsche's call for us to become Übermensch. We need to become masters of our own minds, our own language, and ultimately our own destinies.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've explored so many of Nietzsche's key ideas, his critiques of traditional morality, his analysis of power, his concept of the will to power, and his vision of the Übermensch. And yet, I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
I agree. Nietzsche's work is incredibly dense and multifaceted. There's always something new to discover, another layer to peel back, another perspective to consider.
Well, before we get too overwhelmed, let's take a pause here and continue our deep dive into Nietzsche's world in the next part. We still have so much to discuss, including his views on women, his thoughts on religion, and his ideas about art and creativity.
I'm looking forward to it. There's never a dull moment when exploring the world of Nietzsche.
Right, so we spent the last two parts really unpacking a lot of Nietzsche's ideas. But before we wrap things up, I kind of want to bring it back down to earth a bit. How can we actually apply this stuff to our own lives?
Well, Nietzsche, he didn't want his philosophy to just be some kind of abstract intellectual exercise.
Right.
Like, he really believed that his work could help people live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Yeah, he was all about self-discovery and personal transformation. So as you've been listening along, have any of these ideas really resonated with you? Or maybe challenged some of your assumptions?
I think Nietzsche's work has this way of kind of holding up a mirror to your own soul. It makes you really confront your beliefs, your values, even your deepest fears.
Definitely doesn't shy away from pushing those buttons, does he? But I think that discomfort can be a good thing sometimes, right? It can push us to grow and change in ways we might not have thought possible before.
Absolutely. And I think that's what Nietzsche was really trying to do. He wasn't pretending to have all the answers. In fact, he actually thought that the search for answers was more important than finding those answers themselves.
So it's not about finding some prepackaged set of beliefs or rules to follow, but it's more about embarking on that journey of self-discovery.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that journey, it takes courage. It takes a willingness to question everything. And it takes a commitment to becoming the best version of yourself that you can be.
And that's where the whole will to power concept comes into play.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not about dominating other people or trying to become some kind of dictator, but it's more about mastering yourself, overcoming those limitations that are holding you back, and then creating a life that truly aligns with what you value most.
So it's harnessing that inner drive to really become the artist of your own life.
Right. Exactly. And that's a huge part of what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch. It's not about becoming some kind of superhuman being or anything like that, but it's about realizing that potential that exists inside each of us to really transcend those things that hold us back, and then to create something truly extraordinary.
Now, before we wrap things up completely, I want to circle back to a couple of things that we touched on earlier. Specifically, Nietzsche's views on women and his critique of religion. These are definitely topics that tend to generate a lot of controversy and debate. What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to keep in mind when they're engaging with these parts of his work?
Well, when it comes to Nietzsche's views on women, I think it's really important to approach his writing with a critical eye. We talked about this before, but some of his statements can definitely be interpreted as sexist and misogynistic. And I don't think we should shy away from acknowledging that, but we also can't just reduce his whole perspective to a few provocative quotes or anything like that.
Right, he was a product of his time.
Yeah.
And those views on gender roles were definitely shaped by the social norms that were prevalent in 19th century Europe.
Exactly. And while it's important to be critical of any genuinely harmful or outdated views, I think we also need to try to understand, the complexity and nuance of his thinking on this subject.
So it's about approaching his work with an open mind, but also a critical lens.
Right.
And recognizing that there are both limitations and potential insights to be found in his writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, what about his critique of religion? He's often labeled as an atheist, but I'm not sure if that's really an accurate portrayal of his views.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than that. While Nietzsche was very critical of organized religion, especially Christianity, His views on spirituality were way more nuanced.
Yeah.
He wasn't necessarily rejecting the idea of a higher power or even the importance of spiritual experience. But what he was really rejecting was like the blind faith, the dogma, and those like rigid moral codes that he felt were kind of like stifling human potential.
So it wasn't about spirituality itself, but more about how it was being used to control people and prevent them from thinking for themselves.
Exactly. And that's what he was getting at with that whole God is dead statement. He wasn't saying that God literally died, but he was talking about the decline of these traditional belief systems that he felt weren't serving humanity anymore.
So it's more about taking responsibility for your own beliefs and values and like forging your own path spiritually.
Exactly. It's about creating your own meaning in a world where there might not be any like easy answers or pre-packaged truths.
I like that. And it really fits with his overall emphasis on self-creation and like that whole will to power idea we talked about.
Absolutely. Nietzsche, he wasn't just about tearing things down.
Right.
He also gave us this really powerful vision of what a more fulfilling life could look like. A life filled with passion and creativity and a constant drive to like become the best version of yourself.
And that's what's so inspiring about his work. Even though he challenges us to confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world, he still offers this message of hope and empowerment.
Definitely. He reminds us that we all have this incredible power to shape our own destinies, to overcome even the toughest challenges, and to create lives that are truly meaningful and authentic.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of Friedrich Nietzsche. We've covered a lot of ground today, from his critiques of traditional morality and religion, to his ideas about the will to power, the Übermensch, and the importance of self-creation.
And I really hope that this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and maybe even inspired you to think about the world in a whole new way.
Remember, Nietzsche wasn't about giving us easy answers. He wanted us to ask those tough questions, to provoke our thinking, and to encourage us to embark on our own journeys of self-discovery.
So as you go back out into the world, take Nietzsche's spirit with you, embrace the power of questioning, celebrate your individuality, and never stop exploring all of that incredible potential that lies within you.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning everything, and keep becoming.
And never be afraid to embrace your inner Übermensch.